Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Walk Podcast. So, the last couple weeks, we have rolled out why would Jesus want me? How do I say yes to Jesus? And I think before we move into the next phase, I think it would be important that we talk about one of the aspects and ways that we can really grow in our relationship with Christ. And that's, of course, reading the Bible. Now, most churches have their own kind of list of what they say you should, what they recommend reading. It's not like there's a right way or a wrong way. Don't get me wrong. If you want to start at the front and end at the back like you would a normal book, you absolutely can. However, I think there's some important things that we should touch on before you dig in the Bible if you haven't. And I think it's important to understand who Jesus is. You'll hear the phrase, read the Old Testament through the lens of Christ. And I think it's important to get that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that saying, because when we understand who Jesus is, when we understand what Jesus does, when we start to see all of the things and these little snippets we're going to get as we read the New Testament of the prophecy that Jesus is fulfilling, when you go back and then you read the Old Testament, what you find is there's so much more that points towards him. I think that's one aspect. The other aspect of it is getting to know who the Jews are and what they went through. And I'll kind of touch more on this stuff at the end. So I just kind of wanted to lay out the books that I would read if I were to start now, and in this particular order. And then from there, you can kind of branch out and do what you want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the book. And then what I'll do is I'll give you a little, like a one-line description what it is, and then I'll maybe give you a very short and light synopsis of it. This isn't going to be a big teaching, but there's several books I want to get through, and it's more about laying out a list. And of course, at the end, I will put the books on screen, that in the order of which I put them out there, but also I will put a link I'll put in the description also, where you can go in the description and you can take them down. So anyway, let's get started. So if I were to start out today, I would read the book of John first. And the book of John tells the story of Jesus. It's the Apostle John telling the story from his perspective as he walked with Jesus. He was literally one of the apostles, right? So he got to walk with Jesus for 3.5 years. In it he recounts all the signs and the miracles and the wonders that Jesus performed. And he kind of helps you bring them alive in the reader's mind. And honestly, I don't think there's a better book in the Bible that really expresses and describes the love of Christ better than the book of John. The book of John also, John refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. He insinuates in there that he may have been quite possibly Jesus' best friend that he had here on earth while he was here, which would make sense because Jesus tried to model that his life walk on earth was very much like ours. And so, of course, he would have individuals that he related better with, that he was closer to. So it makes sense that perhaps John was his best friend. And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean he loved John more than anyone else. We all have people that we love and some that we like more, right? Also, I'm going to try to talk about something noteworthy in every book. So the Apostle John is, of course, not John the Baptist. So some people, when they first start reading the Bible, they think that maybe the Apostle John is John the Baptist, and they are not the same. In fact, he's the only one of the 12 apostles that was not martyred. Of course, Judas is excluded here because he betrayed Jesus and killed himself. But even though he wasn't martyred, he was severely persecuted. In fact, one thing I'll say is he was dropped in a vat of boiling oil and survived. And at the end of his life, he was exiled to an island called Patmos. I think every time I hear Patmos, I just think of back in San Francisco where they would just send the convicts to an island. Same kind of thing, right? Okay, so the second book that I would move into if I were to start today is I would move into Romans. So Romans is all about Christian beliefs. This book is addressed to us, the Gentiles. So if you're not a Jew who's converting to Christianity, then congratulations, this book is literally written for you. In this book, the Apostle Paul summarizes the Christian beliefs in 16 chapters. This book will answer many of your questions on what Christians believe. In fact, Pastors and teachers could preach on this one single book for years and years and years and years. There's just so much in this book. Also, the noteworthy thing on this is Paul is a great example of forgiveness of God. And once you get to know the Bible a bit more and you get to read more about Paul, you'll understand that you too can truly be forgiven. In a previous video, I talked about how some of the things that Paul had done, and I'll kind of touch on it here just in case you haven't seen that video, but you should really go watch that video too. The other thing about Paul is his writing. He was a very brilliant man, and sometimes his writing is really hard to read, especially if you're maybe reading the NASB or the NIV or the ESV or the New King James Version. His writing, especially until you get used to how he writes, can be very difficult to understand. So don't be afraid to use a different translation. Like the NLT is a great translation if you're not quite grasping what the Bible's saying, you can go to the NLT, you can read it, and that just kind of brings it more into our English, and it helps you better understand it. And there's nothing wrong with the NLT, even if you stayed there. But if you prefer, like, say, the NIV or the ESV and you can't understand it, go check out the NLT. And if that doesn't work, if that's not working for you, then go ask your pastor or anyone that's a ministry leader or a teacher in your church or anybody that you know that's spiritually mature. They would love to help you better understand what it is that Paul is writing. It's really important that you grasp what Paul writes because Paul writes a lot of books in the Bible, okay? And believe me, we will definitely get into a lot more of Paul's writing on this channel as we move forward, okay? So the next book that I would read is Ephesians. And Ephesians is all about how to live a holy life. And again, here we find Apostle Paul writing again. However, this time he's writing to a particular church in Ephesus. He addresses how to walk in grace, peace, and love. This book clarifies where and how we achieve our salvation. He's addressing both Jew and Gentile here. Don't get me wrong. He's using examples to describe what the church of Christ should look like. He explains to us how to wage a spiritual battle, because if you don't think that there's a spiritual war going on around you, I want to assure you there is. There are things happening in the unseen realm that we can't see. Well, most of us can't see. There are definitely people that can see into that, but there is a war for your soul, and the enemy is trying to derail you from God. And all he's there to do is to kill, steal, and destroy. And that's all he wants to do. And so there's a war going on. He helps teach us how to fight that war. You know, I talked about Paul writing a lot of the books, and I think it's noteworthy that you know that there are 27 books in the New Testament, and generally there's 13 to 14 of them that are attributed to Paul. You know, there's Hebrews that we're not really sure about if it was Paul or not. When you read Hebrews, it sure looks like his writing, but it doesn't mean there wasn't other contributing authors in that. But he has certain letters like Ephesians that's written to a particular church, and these are called epistles to churches. And there are 7 letters to churches, and we know that these are definitely the writings of Paul. Okay. Let's move into another book of Paul that I would suggest. The next book would be Philippians. Philippians is all about finding joy and worshiping in trials. And I know that sounds counterproductive, but honestly, it's true. Finding joy when we're encountering trials is a big step. And you know, before I kind of talk about Paul, I just want to say something here. We can say a lot to people out there as we walk out the Great Commission, as we try to evangelize and bring people to Christ. And, you know, some people, we can say the right words, we can plant the right seed, but, you know, for a lot of people, it's what they see and see how we walk in this life that will bring them to Christ, because they start to see that I want what he has, or I want what she has. You know, I'll bring up COVID again, and I know I talked about this in another video, but, you know, the people that were rooted in Christ, that knew that they were leaning upon the rock that is Christ, it isn't that they didn't feel fear at times when it came to COVID, but they knew that Jesus would walk them through. And the other thing that they knew is even if COVID killed them, they just get to go home to see their God. You know, and you have a certain comfort with death when you know where you're going. And so when people see you in times of trial, like when we had the nation and a world in a trial that it was under, when you saw people walking not in fear, but in courage and in bravery and in love, and they were out serving and they were out doing the jobs that many people were locked in their homes too afraid to go outside. Here are these Christians out doing things. And again, I'm not saying this if you were a Christian and you didn't go out there. I'm not calling you out or anything, but I am saying that if you're truly rooted in Christ, things of this world, while they may give you fear, God will help you walk in courage right through that fear. Because the enemy likes to put up this great big wall of fear as if it's a brick wall that's on fire and you can't walk through it. And Jesus is saying, just step into it, my son or my daughter. And as you step into it, you realize there's no wall there at all and the flames aren't real. And he can walk you through it. Okay? So Philippians is a letter that he writes of encouragement to a church in Philippi. He teaches them how to properly worship and find joy in Jesus Christ. The good news of Jesus Christ at this point, in back then it's still probably called the Way. It's not called Christianity yet. It's spreading rapidly through the Middle East now, what we know as the Middle East. Persecution and hardships are becoming commonplace for believers. But despite the persecution, he encourages them to rejoice because that suffering has worth. Because what they're seeing real time is the more people are being persecuted, the more suffering that's happening, it's actually helping spread the word of Jesus Christ. It's helping spread the gospel. And it isn't just for this time. We see this throughout history that when Christians are persecuted, revival comes. God has this amazing way of when his people are being persecuted and they're suffering, he finds a way, because I was talking about how we walk through life. Man, he finds a way to just raise up more believers. And there's something about watching people who believe something so much that they're willing to not only die and be persecuted for it, but actually helping people while they're struggling through it. There's something really powerful about that. That brings me to another thought. Back in like the Black Plague, there was some of the biggest revival we've seen in a long time, for a long time up to that point, was during the Black Plague. And that was because people were dying all over the place from the Black Plague, and people were running from these cities. They were fleeing from people because they were afraid they were going to die. I mean, hence kind of COVID kind of thing. It was just a different world. But my point is that many Christians ran towards the cities, and they were the one that were tending to the sick. They were the ones that were burying the dead. They were the ones that were consoling the survivors, and they stood in the face of Black Death, but they still put other people's needs over their own. When people see that, they respect that, and they want what you have. Okay. Also, a noteworthy point about this book, about Philippians, is Paul actually wrote it from prison. So in the letter, he's actually thanking the church of Philippi because not only did they send him some gifts, they also, which were financial gifts and probably some other hardship gifts, but they also sent an assistant to help him. So it's a pretty cool book. The next book I would recommend is Acts. And the book of Acts is basically how Christianity spread after the death of Christ. So the book of Acts is written by Luke. It recounts what happens after Jesus died and when he was raised from the dead and ascended into heaven to sit at the right hand of the Father. So the event of his ascension is here when he actually ascends into heaven, and this is called the Pentecost. The Pentecost is such an amazing event to read about because there was so many cool things that happened, and it's a moment where we get to see Peter, who actually denied Jesus 3 times, and all those things. How all of a sudden this guy that denied Jesus 3 times stands in front of all these people and just boldly proclaims what's happening. It's such a cool event. Acts also describes basically the establishment of Jesus' church. It's from its early expansion, and then of course the inclusion of the Gentiles in, because it started with the Jews and then it went to the Gentiles, and the Jews were all circumcised, Gentiles were not circumcised, so there was debates that needed to happen about how you came in, and they had to carefully navigate whether certain works were necessary in order to be saved. And so a lot of, actually some of the things that I've talked about so far is described in Acts. This is also where we meet the man named Saul, Saul of Tarsus, who becomes Paul. And of course, he was responsible for beating and imprisoning Christians. He was even complicit in the murder of Christians, including the first martyr, Stephen. Luke is regarded as the author of the Gospel of Luke and also known as Luke the Evangelist. He was a very educated man. We believe he was a physician. He was also a historian, and in fact, most even historians today recognize him as probably the first Christian historian. He is very methodical and detailed in his investigations. So even though he wasn't an eyewitness to Jesus and his walk, he carefully investigated everything from the beginning. Luke was very important because without this book, we'd be hard pressed to understand just how Christianity grew from this small sect into what it is today. This massive movement that we have today. So for me, that is where I would start when it came to the New Testament. At this point is when I would start to transition to the Old Testament. Because I think now you have a good grasp on a bit of who Jesus is, how he lived, what some of the things that he taught his apostles, some of the things that he said to the religious leaders. You've got to hear some of what Paul has had to say about how we're supposed to live, how we're supposed to handle trials. We have a nice kind of foundation of who Jesus is, which will help us to be able to read the Old Testament in a manner of which we can see Jesus in the Old Testament. And I think it's so helpful to start that way. Because after all, Jesus was a Jew. Okay, so he believed in the traditions of the Jews. He followed the traditions of the Jews. The things that were brought about in the Old Testament were things that Jesus did, that Jesus followed, and they were important to him. And these cultural things, these things are important, and it helps us to better understand what the New Testament is saying by understanding the Old Testament, not just the books of the Old Testament, but the culture of the Jewish people. And that's something that I would really recommend you doing is if you find any books out there, like I think there's a book called like The Forgotten Jesus, or that talks about some of the heritage and the culture and the customs of the Old Testament Jews, because some of the things that Jesus says, we don't understand them. And then when you understand the culture, it changes so much and makes it so much more rich and deep when you read it. And the other important thing is Jesus quoted the Bible of the Old Testament a lot. And if Jesus knew the Old Testament and he's quoting from it, then we should know it too. There are many instances also of foreshadowing of Christ in the Old Testament, and it's much easier to see them having read at least parts of the New Testament first. So again, it just helps everything. It helps you understand the language that is being used in the New Testament. It's understanding some of the nuance of the things that are being said in the New Testament. It just helps you better overall understand the Bible. So let's move on. Okay, so the Old Testament. So I'm just going to have you go to the start of the book, Genesis. So Genesis is the creation story. In Genesis, we find a description of what God did to create our universe and us. We find out in Genesis who we are, that we are created in God's image, and he created them male and female. Are we struggling with that today at all? Okay, he's very clear on who we are, male and female. In the book, we also find out how the world falls into sin, how human beings begin to rebel against God, and how we lost our relationship, the relationship that we had with God. Because, in the beginning, and I don't want to give too much of the book away, right? But in the beginning, Adam and Eve are literally walking with God. Because they haven't sinned yet. So they can stand in front of a holy God. But once they sinned, they couldn't stand with him anymore. This is where we also learn about how bad things are getting on earth, and God has to wipe basically everything off the planet. This is where we learn about Noah and the giant flood, the great flood, right? After Noah, we learn about Abram, who becomes Abraham. and how him and his wife's choices echo through today. I talked about this in the previous video. I talk about how Abram and his wife decide that Abram should take another wife, Hagar, and he wanted an heir, and he had grown disillusioned with the promise of God. So they decided, hey, let's try this. And so then they had Ishmael. And as I state in that video, Ishmael is a direct line to Muhammad and Islam. And so there's two bloodlines now fighting over the same covenant that is Israel. Do we see that happening today at all? Yeah, that's how far back this goes. So also in this book, we learn about many of the heroes of our faith. In the Old Testament too, it's really, and especially in Genesis, it's particularly important to understand and recognize when disobedience happens, what follows disobedience. And I think way too often today, especially Christians who are new Bible readers, they think that these men and women that walked before us were somehow so much more righteous and less sinful than we were. And when you read the Old Testament, what you quickly start to find out is they're no different than us. And I touched on that in a previous video also, but I think it's important to understand that there was only one person that walked this planet that was perfect in his walk, and that was Christ. And he had to be, because that was our only way to heaven. That was our only way to the Father. I think it's noteworthy that many, if not most of the stories that the world knows about the Bible, so the people in the secular world, people that are atheists or agnostics, come from the book of Genesis. They know Adam and Eve, they know Noah and the ark, they know about Cain and Abel. Most people can't quote much from much of the Bible, but they know a lot from this. The next book I would recommend is Exodus. So Exodus is about God freeing the Israelites. So the Israelites at this time find themselves slaves in Egypt, and they are praying and they're crying out to God for help. And so he raises up a leader named Moses to lead them out of Egypt into the land he had promised. And an interesting part about this is Moses is a very reluctant leader, which I think what you'll kind of find in ministry for a lot. I know a lot of them we didn't start out wanting to lead. We didn't step into this wanting to be a ministry leader, a pastor, a teacher. We just wanted to get to know Jesus better. And then as we got to know him better, we found a call on us. And every one of us, every one of you out there, as you grow in your relationship with Christ, you'll find a call. And when you find that call, I'm just telling you, do yourself a favor. Don't run from it. Just walk and step into it. Even no matter what it looks like, just step into it, because there are blessings and there is growth and there's peace and there's joy and there are things waiting for you, and there are people, souls waiting for you to step into your calling. You know, I before I started this podcast, I was doing a training on podcasting, and there's a guy named Sean Cannell who has Think Media, and I was doing a training with him, and one of the questions he posed was, who out there is waiting for you to start your podcast? And, you know, for those of us that are starting Christian podcasts, those were heavy words. And those words really helped me, because within just a couple of short weeks, I was doing this. So God's power is revealed throughout Exodus, through several signs and wonders and miracles. And it's just amazing the things that he does in this. But also, you get to see some of the enemy's schemes and some of the things that the enemy can do, which will foreshadow even going all the way to the book of Revelation, and some of the things that Jesus says, some of the things the Apostle Paul talks about. There's things in this that you can see relate to that. We also receive the 10 Commandments. If you don't know the whole story, it's more than just Moses going up the mountain, getting the 2 tablets and coming down. It's a much deeper story than that. And that part starts to me, it starts to really, at least it did for me, it brought to fruition just how heavy our sins are, how heavy it is when we're disobedient. Is Exodus really started to awaken that for me. And, you know, it's because of the disobedience of the Israelites that a walk that should have taken them about 6 months when they left Egypt, should have taken them 6 months to get to the promised land, ended up taking 40 years. So it's a great book. The next book I would recommend is Deuteronomy, which is basically Moses' final sermon. This book is essentially Moses giving his final sermon at the end of his life, and he's recounting the law of God, and what God has promised the Israelites, what he's promised the Jewish people. Because of what happened in Exodus, I was talking about how it took 40 years. Because of what happened, there was disobedience by Moses in this time too. And so Moses is not allowed to set foot in the promised land. Moses tells them at this point also that a prophet will be raised up to carry on the mission. From the perspective of those alive that's hearing this at the time, it's pretty obvious that as we get into the next book and stuff, it's actually the book of Joshua. It's actually Joshua, son of Nun, is I think. But from the lens of Christ, when you read Moses' words, you start to see Jesus in the things that he's talking about, the way that it's written. Because when you look at Deuteronomy 18 verses 15 and 18, in my opinion, it points more directly to Christ than to Joshua. And here's what it says. It says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him." And again, that's Deuteronomy 18:15. Now, this is Moses speaking to the people about what the Lord will do. And in verse 18, it is God speaking to the people through Moses about what will happen. Okay? So in verse 18, it says, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him." That's Deuteronomy 18:18. Now, you can see where Joshua maybe fits into this a bit, but when you put Jesus into that, he fits those two verses perfectly. And at some point, we'll discuss the prophets and the leaders and how much there's different types of Christ throughout the Old Testament. These types of Christ not only point to someone greater, but how God shares shared characteristics among them. There's parallels and even similar walks that a lot of these earlier Adams or Christ, however you want to look at it, actually have together. It's this amazing consistencies that God puts between them and Christ, and it's amazing when you start to see that stuff and you realize this is thousands of years before Jesus, hundreds if not thousands of years before Jesus ever came. God does allow Moses one thing though, and I think this is noteworthy. So before Moses dies, he goes up on a mountain and he's allowed to look at the land that he's giving to the Israelites. I want you to take particular note when you do read this, how that conversation with God goes. It feels like it's a concession of God to allow him up there. It's also very noteworthy that Moses dies on that mountaintop and God buries him himself. So none of the Israelites and none of us to this day know where Moses is buried. There's a lot of reasons why maybe that happened. I think for me, when I start to think about it, I just think of how much the Israelites maybe would have not walked away from there, or they would have possibly, that tomb wherever he was buried could have become an idol for the Israelites. So there's a lot of reasons why, I think. But I think it's very interesting that God chose to give Moses this look, and then he dies up there, and then nobody else buried him but God. So the next book that I would recommend is Joshua. So Joshua is Moses' successor. Moses said there would be a prophet raised up for them for the immediate moment, and it's Joshua, son of Nun. We learned about Joshua and Caleb in Exodus. So Joshua leads the Israelites into the promised land to take over the cities and to rid the land of evil. And it's filled with corrupt inhabitants, and their habits are just counterintuitive to God's word. This is a land filled with people with all sorts of idols, with different gods and different beliefs, and they would just corrupt the Israelites if they didn't do what they were told. The interesting thing is the Israelites remained pretty faithful to God's covenant with them. And then, of course, there's times where they are definitely disobedient. When they're faithful, God blesses them. When they're disobedient, they have trouble. I think it's noteworthy that there were only two people From the generation that walked out of Egypt with Moses, there's only two people that got to walk on to that land. I mentioned them earlier, Joshua and Caleb. And as you read the book of Exodus, you will understand why those two were the ones that were allowed to step in. The next book that I would recommend is Proverbs. And Proverbs basically tells us how to live wise. Proverbs is a collection of writing that helps us live more wisely and bring about justice to a corrupt and dark world. The teachings in this book are moral teachings and generalized observations about life. The purpose of this book is to help us find wisdom, and it speaks on dozens of different aspects of our life. And just to name a few is there's money, there's work, there's marriage, children, anger, our thoughts, sex. And these are just a handful of the examples out there. It's an amazing book to lean upon when you're struggling with whether something is right or wrong. And it'll help give you a foundation of understanding what is right, what is wrong, and how to walk through some of these things in our life. It's noteworthy that King Solomon is attributed with the writing of much of this book. However, there are other men, wise men, that were contributing to these teachings as well. The next book is the book of Psalms, which is a long book, and it's a big book. It's about prayer, it's about praise, and it's about worship. Psalms is actually a collection of 150 songs. These songs were sung by the Israelites both to God in worship and prayer. They were also sung to each other. There are numerous types of songs in the book, including cries of need, worship, laments, praise, thanksgiving, prophecy, and various types of emotions. There were numerous authors in this book, including Moses, Solomon, and even King David. So at this point is probably where I'm going to stop, where I would say this is what I recommend you reading. I could continue on and on and on about how to read it, but if you started out with what I just talked about, I think you would have a really good grasp and a foundation of not only who Jesus is, you would have a good foundation of where we came from and how it started. And then, you can kind of move on from there. For me, basically reading from Genesis through 2 Samuel is like an epic novel for me. I think it could be made into a series of movies that would be amazing. It's just such an amazing ride. I can read those books over such a short amount of time, even though it's a lot, because I just get engrossed in it. And I've read it so many times, and every time I read it, I get something else out of it. There's just so many interesting people and men, and how all of them struggled on some level, and yet God used them in mighty ways. And you saw what happened as they trusted him more, as they were more faithful to him. They just kept growing in their power and in the things that they were doing. What I really most of all want you guys to know is you need to read the Bible. And when you read the Bible, don't focus on just one part of the Bible. Now, don't get me wrong. As you grow in relationship with Jesus, he's going to have times where he's going to want you to focus on a book, or even focus on a chapter or a handful of verses, to meditate on them and to really grow on them. You'd be surprised how many messages you hear from pastors, or how many teachers you hear teaching. And it's not from a bunch of books. It's taken from maybe one or two verses, sometimes on just one aspect or one chapter of a book. Because God's plans didn't begin at the beginning of Jesus' earthly life. In fact, according to Peter, they predated the creation of the universe and our world. In 1 Peter 1:20 through 21, he says, "He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him. And so your faith and hope are in God." Again, that's 1 Peter 1:20 through 21. So God sent Jesus at a particular time for a particular purpose. And what we know, it was at the perfect time for the perfect purpose. And it's not by accident, you guys. This is plans that were laid out for thousands of years. And here's the thing. There's so many people that try to discredit the Bible. And I suggest that you go out and you do some Google searching, and start Google searching how many prophecies that Jesus fulfilled while he was here. He fulfilled a lot. There are still others that need to be filled, as we approach the end of times, there are more prophecies to be fulfilled, and I know that he will fulfill every last one of them. But when you start to see like the number that they come up with, what it would take for someone to line up and to fulfill those prophecies, there's so many zeros there, you won't even believe it. You won't even believe it. To think that a group of normal men could put together something like this is just asinine. It is crazy to think that men could do this. You know, I want to talk another thing about the Bible. You know, you talk about, I hear all the time from atheists that the New Testament was just a bunch of goat herders who got together and put together a good story, and they'll even give it some credit, and they'll say things like, I mean, there's a lot of wise things in there that we could probably live by. So I want to just, if there's anybody that's watching this that doesn't believe that the Bible is real, I'm going to pose a question to you that I want you just to think about and answer for yourself. So what people will say is that 12 people got together and they came up with a lie, the lie about Jesus Christ raising from the dead, because there is no doubt anybody that has any objective viewpoint at all, tons of secular atheist historians will say Jesus Christ was a real man who lived. Jesus Christ was a real man that was crucified. The big problem is did he really raise from the dead? Because if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, then none of this matters. It's just another prophet who shared a lot of wise stuff. Okay, so I want you to think about this. 12 guys got together and they made up a story that Jesus Christ raised from the dead, visited them and many other people, hundreds of other people. Okay, so they make up this story. They all know it's a lie. Now, they could sell this lie to other people, and other people would gladly go and die for it. We've seen it happen countless times throughout history. It's happening right now in Israel with all the jihadists and everything else. They are dying for a lie, but they believe that lie. So you mean to tell me there's 12 men that made a lie, to come up with this, they come up with a lie, and they believe it so much that they're willing to be crucified upside down, stoned, dropped into vats of oil. They were run through with swords. They were beheaded. There was so many things. And here's the thing, and this is what we don't know. We don't know a lot about what happened with their families, but we can look at what happens, what we just saw witness in Israel, and we can bet that their families are very likely tortured or maybe killed in front of them too. And they all did this, and not one of them ever said, hey, just kidding, my bad, we made it all up. We made it all up. Can we go now? That's what I want you to understand. Why would 12 people be tortured and die for something they know is a lie? They wouldn't. They just wouldn't. Maybe you could get one or two of them to do it because they're just crazy, but there's no way you could get 11, 12 people to do that. You just couldn't. So when you hear people say that the Bible's made up, and the world has been trying, the enemy's been trying to eradicate the Bible since it got put on parchment, and yet it just keeps holding on. Only God could do it. Every time they try to discredit it, that this person made the Bible different, they rewrote the Bible, and then we'll find a parchment from thousands of years ago that proves that what we see is what they saw. We find things about the New Testament, and we find that what they wrote and what we have is the same thing. So anybody that tells you the Bible isn't true has not, number one, done any research, and number two, is disingenuous at best. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. In the Bible, we find out who we are and why we need Jesus Christ. Just as the Jews did. Make no mistake, we're no different than they are. So when you see them being disobedient, when you see them falling down and losing their way, and you're thinking, how could you guys see all this stuff and you've witnessed all this and then yet you walk away from him? How could you do this? I want you to walk into your bathroom and turn on the light and look in the mirror, because you are them. I am them. Because Jesus will do these amazing things in my life and all around me, and I'll see healings, and I'll see restorations, and I'll see families being brought together. I'll see all these different things, and you know what? Then all of a sudden, I forget. And here I am, find myself sinning again, and I can't understand how I got here. So we're no better than they are. The other thing I want you to understand is in the Bible, it talks about how we are adopted, how Jesus has adopted the Gentiles into the Jews, into the Jewish culture, into Christianity. And I want you to understand what the word adoption means in the Greek. So to be adopted in the Greek language, means that we are basically, when you're adopted, you get all the rights and the privileges that come along with that bloodline, with that lineage. So if you are adopted in, you are an heir and you get access to the property, let's say, all the same things as if you were born of that. What that means for us Gentiles is that means that all the promises of the Bible are for us. All the things that Jesus promised are for us. All the things the apostles write about are for us, because we've been grafted into the vine, that we are a part of the family now. One other thing I want to speak about is our Jewish brothers and sisters that still haven't come to Christ, that still haven't recognized Jesus as the Messiah. Be very, very careful about what you say about Jews and what you think about Jews, because I want you to understand something. And I know I say this phrase a lot, but make no mistake, they are God's chosen people. And he has a plan for them. And some of them may be lost right now, but he has a plan for them. And they are his covenant. So they are the original vine, and we are grafted into that vine that is Jesus, right? He's a part of that original Jewish vine. We have to understand that we are grafted in. So if we start to get haughty like they were to Christ, how quickly will he break that branch right off and get rid of you? So just be respectful and understand. And yes, speak to the Jewish people in your life about Christ. It's amazing when a Jewish person comes to Christ, because when they come to Christ, the words that they say, I don't know, they just have such powerful testimonies, and their words carry so much weight because of their heritage. So I think I'm just going to kind of leave it off at this. I just think it's an amazing start to where you can get through the Bible on a level. I would strongly suggest that you download the YouVersion app and you find yourself a reading plan where you can read the whole Bible in a year. Mark Driscoll has a plan that's really good that you can read, and he actually on his Fridays is very light, so you have a chance to catch up and maybe do some notes. Another one that I have went through several times is the Bible with Nicky Gumbel. That's a really good one too. That one's really good when you're starting out, because at the beginning of each thing, before you read that day, he does basically a light teaching of what you're going to be reading. So you walk into things kind of better understanding it before you even read it. But there's tons of plans out there, and guys, there's so much stuff out there to help you learn the Bible. Don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of the language or the verbiage or the things that are being done. There are ways to understand it. Don't run from it. You need to know God's word. So I hope this helps you guys out. Thank you so much for your time. If you found value in this, please like it. And please, again, subscribe. It really does help my channel. If there's somebody else out there that that could gain value or insights from this, please don't be afraid to share it. And if you haven't, follow me on Facebook yet, The Walk. It's out there on Facebook. Please look for it. Come to me on the Facebook. Leave me a message. I try to share something Monday through Friday on there, and I always post my videos there too, so that you can find a link to the YouTube channel. So again, just thank you so much. I appreciate the prayers, and please keep praying for me so that I can find the time and the energy and the wherewithal to be able to do these things. I guess I want to grow this channel. I know the Lord wants to grow this channel, and so just keep praying for me. I appreciate it. I will keep praying for you. I love each and every one of you. I pray for protection, provision, favor, and health over all of you. Have a great week, guys.